Something's off, clearly. I don't know exactly what it is, but we can all see that Jaylen Milroe has gone backwards for about 3 weeks now. We know how good he can be when he's at his best. He's one of the best playmakers in the country, but he has not been that the last 3 weeks. And one thing that I'm concerned about for him is it seems like their offensive philosophy has become all Milroe all the time.
Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports, inspired by football legend Joe Namath. Embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in a new app coming soon. Welcome to Beat Everyone. I am Ben Flanagan, and here we are back again after a loss of not beating anyone, it seems, this season. Well, 5 people so far, 5 teams anyway, and it isn't even November. Alabama already has 2 losses, and as everybody has reminded us, this is the first time that Alabama has had 2 losses prior to November since 2011, or at least prior to Nick Saban's birthday, as our guest pointed out in a recent column. The correlation here being that it was Nick Saban's first season in 2007, and we're obviously watching Kalen DeBoer in his first year in that role. And joining me to break that down, what happened in Knoxville and what might happen in Tuscaloosa, is columnist Kevin Scarbinsky. You can subscribe to his work on AL.com. Kevin, welcome. Glad to have you.
Hey, Ben. Good to be with you.
You know, Kevin, before we get too far into the weeds of this team's second loss in 3 games, you had an interesting column where you said that we could blame none other than Nick Saban for all this. And, you know, he told his ESPN pal, the new Saban whisperer, Pat McAfee, that for Alabama players, Alabama-Tennessee was a bigger rivalry than any other game that they played, even bigger than Auburn. It was harder to get them up for the Iron Bowl in some years than it was for the Tennessee game. And, you know, before the Vandy game, Sabin said that Nashville was the easiest place to play because Alabama always had more fans in the stadium, and then they lose. He keeps giving these teams bulletin board material, and Alabama keeps losing. So, Kevin, is Sabin really part of the problem here?
I think sitting next to Pat McAfee has affected Nick Saban's brain. I think there's some osmosis going on. I don't know if he's trying to out rodeo clown Mr. McAfee, but it's just he is saying some outrageous things. It makes my head explode as someone who has covered the Iron Bowl since 1985. The very first one that I attended was the kick, which told me how special that game was. The 52-yard field goal, of course, by Van Tiffen for Alabama to beat Auburn at Legion Field. Whenever I hear things like that, I think, are you 100 years old? Were you here when Bear Bryant and General Neyland were matching wits? Because in the modern era, in the Saban era, the Auburn game has been far bigger, far more competitive, far more compelling than the Alabama-Tennessee game. All you have to do is look at the record. Nick Saban was 16-1 against the Vols. He lost his last trip to Knoxville a couple of years ago. He was 12-5 against Auburn, and he was very fortunate not to be 10-7 because he almost suffered the great embarrassment of losing to Brian Harsin and Hugh Freeze on Alabama's last 2 trips to Jordan-Hare. So get out of here with that noise, Nick Saban, that the Tennessee game was more compelling to your players, that you had to work harder to get your players up for Auburn. Yeah, that's why you lost 5 times to Auburn. That's why you didn't three-peat in 2013. That's why you got knocked out of the playoffs in 2019 by the Tigers, because your players didn't really care as much. Come on. Nonsense, Ben, nonsense.
Kevin, you know, one of the big questions during and after the game in Knoxville was, what's wrong with Jaylen Milroe? And most people think Alabama's starting quarterback seemed out of it during the game. And I think his play obviously reflected that. I mean, he was sloppy passing downfield. He was missing wide open receivers. He was making questionable decisions with the ball. I mean, throwing another tough interception, obviously, early in the game. Kalen DeBoer was asked Monday if Milroe was dealing with any injuries. And he said there's nothing that's going to be holding him back from going out there and being able to help us get a win. I'm confident of that. That's what he said. Okay. Maybe Jaylen Milroe is a little banged up like everybody else is on the team. DeBoer says nothing is holding him back from competing. Are you satisfied with that answer?
Something's off, clearly. I don't know exactly what it is, but we can all see that Jaylen Milroe has gone backwards for about 3 weeks now. We know how good he can be when he's at his best. He's one of the best playmakers in the country, but he has not been that the last 3 weeks. And one thing that I'm concerned about for him is it seems like their offensive philosophy has become all Milroe all the time. You know, he had 59. He touches the ball every snap, but I mean, on Saturday in Knoxville, 45 passes, 27 in the first half, which is crazy to me. Ran the ball 14 times. I think 3 of those were sacks. I just wonder if they're asking him to do too much. Look, it takes a special player, a really special player, a generational player to carry that type of responsibility for an offense. We saw it in this state in 2010 with Cam Newton. He could handle that. I think they're asking Jaylen Milroe to do too much. I think they're not getting enough or asking enough out of their running backs, out of their running game in general. Their running game has leaned heavily on Jaylen to carry the ball with designed runs, which is a good idea given his running ability. But I think all the hits he's taking, I think it's affecting his throwing game. Just that's my armchair quarterback analysis from afar.
Kevin, coaches don't always listen to fans. Sabin certainly didn't, but there are some fans who have expressed a lot of support for Jaylen Milroe. They're sticking with him as their guy under center. He's Alabama's best shot at winning, period. That's how they feel, but others do not feel this way. Like we've said here before, that when Milroe makes mistakes, they are backbreaking. And like Saturday's turnover in the red zone, the pick six and strip sack against Vandy, moments when you cannot turn it over or surrender points on offense. And he does, right? Like it happens. It was only a few weeks ago, though, where Jaylen Milroe was everybody's hero. He was the favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. ESPN talking heads were calling him a potential #1 overall NFL draft pick. I mean, it seems crazy and unfair to even bring this up, but if he keeps turning it over and Alabama keeps stalling out on offense and there appears to be something wrong with him and more to meets the eye, does Jaylen Milroe force Kalen DeBoer's hand and look to Ty Simpson for some first-team reps?
Well, we're at a disadvantage in addressing this subject because we're not at practice every day. We don't see what's happening with the reps that they're getting behind the scenes. But we do remember a year ago when Nick Sabin sat Jaylen Milroe for a game at South Florida, things got really, really ugly. And they were fortunate to get out of Tampa with a victory. Now, Ty Simpson obviously is a different quarterback. The guy who started that game is now playing lacrosse, I think, at Notre Dame. So, who knows? But those players, and this matters more than fans, than coaches, than analysts and observers. Those players seem to believe in Jaylen Milroe, and with good reason. So what happens to the chemistry of that team? What happens to the camaraderie of the team? And particularly in the first year of a new coach and a new coaching staff, where everyone's still getting to know each other. We discount that. We think the transition should be easy. It's not easy. There's a reason Kalen DeBoer is the first Alabama coach since Frank Thomas in 1931, who started 5-1 in his first year in Tuscaloosa. This job is different. Kalen DeBoer is learning how different it is from his previous stops, the scrutiny he's getting, the scrutiny his team's getting on everything he does, his wardrobe, etc. So if you upset that apple cart, and that as severely as you would if you bench Jaylen Milroe, what does that do to the rest of the team? DeBoer has got to have a handle on that better than anyone. So that's a decision he'll have to make if it comes to it, if Jaylen continues to struggle. But that is not a decision you can make easily.
I don't know what you're talking about with the wardrobe thing. We wouldn't know anything about that at AL.com, Kevin. Look, Alabama has a penalty problem, and this isn't new. This was the case in the last few years of Sabin's tenure as head coach, and the team became severely undisciplined at crucial points in the game. And if you thought it was bad on Saturday, and it was with 15 total penalties, I believe, for more than 100 yards, 13, 15, something. It was even worse the last time they played in Knoxville when they had 17. And these aren't ticky-tack 5-yarders either, obviously. I mean, it's an illegal substitution during a punt and critical change of possession against Vandy. It's roughing the passer or pass interference on a huge third down that swings the momentum. It's a hold that calls back a touchdown. That happened earlier in the season several times. I mean, these are massive penalties at the worst possible times. And if you're an Alabama fan, when something good happens, you get a stop on third down, you see a bomb touchdown pass to Ryan Williams, you can't even enjoy it because you're looking to the screen for the yellow flag graphic, right? And more often than not, there it is. So, Kevin, what's wrong with Alabama? Why can't they clean up this penalty problem?
I think that's a great question. And I'm really glad that you have not displayed the same short-term memory loss as a lot of Alabama fans who seem to think that every Nick Saban team was the most disciplined team in the country. They didn't make these kind of mistakes because this has been a pattern. 15 penalties is a lot. They committed 17, or Tennessee accepted 17 against them 2 years ago in Knoxville when Alabama lost 52-49. So the issues that we're seeing from Alabama now didn't just start this year. The struggles against what we perceive as lesser opponents didn't start this year. Go back to last year. I mentioned South Florida. Arkansas, 4-point game against a team that went 1-7 in the SEC. They needed Gravedigger to beat an Auburn team that got pantsed on its own field the week before by New Mexico State and Diego Pavia, who, by the way, is getting ready to make another trip to Auburn in a couple of weeks. Good luck to the Tigers there. So these things didn't just start. You had a lot of players leave. And another issue I have with the perception of this Alabama team is that Nick Saban handed Kalen DeBoer the most talented roster in the country. He's supposed to keep the machine rolling. Let's back up a little bit. Let's look at the players who left. Who was the best defensive player on Alabama's team last year? That's Caleb Downs. That guy's playing for Ohio State. Who's the guy who caught the winning touchdown pass against Auburn on the Gravedigger play? Isaiah Bond. Oh, that's right. He's at Texas. Then there are a lot of other guys that went on to the NFL. So I don't think this Alabama team, I wouldn't put it in the top 5 of the most talented Alabama teams we've seen since Nick Saban got there. But there's this perception that they are far more talented than everybody they play. They should have no problems with the likes of South Carolina. Vanderbilt has no business being on the field with them. And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Vanderbilt has more talent than Alabama or comparable talent. But you get my point. This Alabama team is not as talented as it might have otherwise been had Nick Saban not retired and guys not gotten in the portal to go play elsewhere and maybe make some more money. So these are all issues, Ben, that have been ongoing. There's a reason, and there was a decline in let's be honest. It's a subtle thing. You go from winning national championships on the regular to competing for them, but not winning them. They won 5 out of 9 from 09 to 17. They've won 1 since. They're probably not going to win this year, which would be the 6th time. In 7 years, they didn't win the national championship. They're probably not going to make the playoff unless they completely turn things around in a hurry. That would be the 3rd time in the last 6 years they didn't make the playoff. So the decline has been subtle, but it's been noticeable. And Kalen DeBoer so far has not been able to tap the brakes and reverse that.
Kevin, one more on the Tennessee game. I mean, before 2022, Alabama beat Tennessee 15 times in a row while Nick Saban was head coach. I mean, Tennessee beat Alabama for the 2nd time in 18 years on Saturday. But there was a stretch in the late 90s and early 2000s when Tennessee had beaten Alabama 7 years in a row. So this rivalry can get streaky, but it's heating up again. Tennessee's wins have been close games, but do we think that this is just a competitive series again? Or do you think that the balance has maybe started to shift under Josh Heupel in Knoxville and Kalen DeBoer in Alabama?
It's too soon, I think, to make that judgment. It's certainly more competitive. You know, Tennessee now has won 2 out of 3, as you said. And last year, in the first half, it looked like Tennessee was going to win. They were going to go back-to-back. And then Alabama completely flipped the script on them in the second half and won by a couple of touchdowns. So Josh Heupel has done a nice job in Knoxville. Surprisingly, they're winning more with defense than offense this year. Offense has been his MO, going back to his days as the Oklahoma quarterback when he won a national championship. So it's a little soon for that. But things are happening now, again, that weren't happening early to mid Nick Saban tenure, like dominating old rivals like Tennessee, and beating teams like Vanderbilt by just rolling out of bed and showing up in Nashville. So it's a little concerning, but I think that's the way college football is going. I don't think necessarily appreciated how extraordinary the dominance of Alabama football was for as long as it was dominant. We had never seen anything like that, not even under Bear Bryant. We'll probably never see it again. Kirby Smart's trying to do that something similar, and they look like they're not ready to give up on another championship chase on Saturday night in Austin with what they did to Texas, especially with the Georgia defense. So, but that's still, he's won 2. He's got a way to go to get into Nick Saban territory. So I think this is the unpredictability of college football that is a natural byproduct of the transfer portal and NIL, and Alabama fans appreciate that you had a dynasty for as long as you did. Now you're not necessarily the biggest, baddest bunch on the block, but enjoy the fact that you've got an opportunity to win every game. Have they gotten blown out? I haven't seen them get blown out. Maybe the second. They haven't been good in the second half, though. What is it, 51-31 combined, Georgia and Tennessee in the second half? That's a concern. But Alabama is normal again, or something close to normal. They were abnormal. They were paranormal for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to sting to hear that for a lot of Alabama fans. But listen, I mean, as soon as Sabin retired, it was different. It was going to be different for the foreseeable future. And now, after watching this season so far, Alabama fans are sort of having to relearn how to do this, right? Like, I mean, they lived through it. We talked about it on a recent episode. It happened fairly recently, right? Like within the last couple of decades where Alabama wasn't very good. And so that's not necessarily the case. They've got a good coach. They have an opportunity still to have a good season. And so you just got to wait and see. But there will be growing pains. And Kevin, you said, barring an unlikely turnaround in your column, that this will be the third time in 6 years Alabama misses the playoffs, right? After getting their 5 straight seasons, in the 6th time in 7 years that Alabama doesn't win a national championship. And you say that maybe DeBoer can figure out what's gone wrong by the Iron Bowl and by the Auburn game, you say. But you called it, again, an unlikely turnaround. Alabama has Missouri at home this week. They've got to play LSU and Oklahoma on the road, and they get Auburn in Tuscaloosa. So it doesn't get easier. It's obviously one at a time with this team. But when you hear things like playoff or bust, even in DeBoer's first season, and a lot of people were saying that about Alabama, what odds do you put on Alabama finishing this year with just 2 losses?
Oh, gosh. Low odds. I'm not an odds maker, so I don't know that I would put a number on it, but I did use the word unlikely. I think there is at least one more loss left on the schedule. LSU in Baton Rouge seems most likely. LSU has just kind of quietly been rolling along since that since that early loss, and so they look surprisingly good, and they've got a quarterback that can take advantage of Alabama's weaknesses in the secondary, in particular, in Garrett Nussmeier. So I don't think Auburn is good enough to beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa. They almost did it last year in Auburn, but we know what happens in Jordan-Hare Stadium. It's a different game. It's a different animal. I don't think Auburn can go to Tuscaloosa and win. Missouri, I think, is extremely mid despite its rankings, having watched that Auburn game over the weekend as well. So I think most likely the toughest test for Alabama ahead certainly is going to be going to Tiger Stadium in Death Valley.
100%, absolutely. LSU looks like a good team, and Alabama's going to have to be that dangerous team that can maybe pull off an upset, even though Alabama, for all we know, could be a favorite going in to Baton Rouge. So we'll have to see. Kevin, I want to get you out of here on this. I want to switch gears for a second, but it's related to something that you wrote recently. You wrote another really good column where you declared Alabama a basketball state. And given what we've seen from the top 2 athletics programs on the football field, fans are probably just as ready to see what they do on the court. Now, under Nate Oates and Bruce Pearl, respectively, Alabama and Auburn's basketball programs are in great shape. And let's focus on Alabama specifically. Their roster is loaded. They have a preseason All-American and SEC Player of the Year in Mark Sears, who just shined in the NCAA tournament last year. They look great in an exhibition game against Wake Forest. They're ranked number 2 preseason in the AP poll. They certainly looked the part. I mean, all signs point to a special season. But Kevin, basketball can't compete with football, can it? I mean, I said after the Final Four run, really, like this was my take. As big as basketball seemed to be at the time, the second, third string tight end caught an out route during garbage time of the A-Day game, basketball would be in the rearview mirror in Tuscaloosa. But as long as Nate Oates is here and they keep making deep runs in March, that isn't really the case, is it?
You're killing me, Ben. No, you're Look, I've had to be really creative at times in the past to pump up basketball in this state. And everyone knows I love basketball. I love football, but basketball is my favorite sport. So to see what's happening now, and that column I wrote that, by the way, Thursday before Alabama lost, Auburn lost, UAB lost, et cetera, in football. And then Alabama looked scary good in what admittedly was an exhibition game against Wake Forest, but they had several guys that didn't play. And sorry to let Auburn fans know that Aiden Holloway can play. And if he's going to get that many catch and shoot threes during the season, he's going to be a real force for Alabama. Like, they need another scorer. And by the way, I'd like to know who the one AP voter out of 55 voters, only one did not put Mark Sears on his first team preseason AP All-American team. Sears did get the most votes, by the way, on that. He's an unbelievable player. So I from a performance standpoint and an expectation standpoint, basketball is here and football is here right now at Alabama. The gap is a lot larger at Auburn and UAB, et cetera, et cetera. So, no, it's incredible what Nate Oates has done. And when's the last time we could say this, Ben? Right now, and Kalen DeBoer has had a phenomenal start to his FBS coaching career. But right now, Alabama has a far more accomplished coach in basketball than it does in football. Kalen DeBoer may change that equation, but Nate Oates has won 4 SEC titles. He's been to the school's first Final Four. He is on the short list of the best coaches in the country. And he may have the most talented roster in the country because he's an incredible recruiter as well. So this could be the best season in Alabama history. They have a better chance than ever to win a national championship this year in basketball, not football.
Unbelievable. And I mean, if you can narrow the gap at all between football and basketball in Tuscaloosa, then you're doing something pretty extraordinary. So I advise people to go read that column if they haven't already. He is Kevin Scarbinsky. You can subscribe to read his column on AL.com. Kevin, thank you so much for doing this.
Ben, this has been fun. And just be careful about dissing basketball in my presence. I might have to reach back and grab my Birmingham Southern ball and throw it at you.
Oh, man, I felt it already. I am Ben Flanagan. Find Beat Everyone on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, rate, review, all podcast things. It really helps us out. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports, inspired by football legend Joe Namath. Embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in a new app coming soon.